All right. Welcome, everybody, to this highly anticipated high research seminar. I'm Michelle Elam. I'm the William Robertson Co-Professor of Humanities in the English Department at Stanford. I'm a former Associate Director of HI and now a Senior Fellow here as well. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speakers, Eleanor Drage and Kerry McInerney. Before we dive into their thoughtful presentation, let's cover a few logistics. For our online attendees at Zoom, please feel free to use the chat for general messages, but direct your questions through Slido and look out for the Slido link in the chat shortly. We'll be using Slido's handy upvote feature to prioritize questions that catch everybody's interest. And then don't worry, we're going to make sure that we have time for both virtual and person questions during the Q&A session as well. So we wanted to dedicate a fair amount of time to all of that. Without further ado, let us turn our attention to our esteemed speakers. Dr. Eleanor Drage, who's coming in from Brussels, joins us all the way from the UK, bringing her expertise as a senior research fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence. She's a trailblazer in feminist and anti-racist approaches to AI ethics and regulation, earning recognition as one of the top 100 brilliant women in AI ethics in the world in 2022. Alongside Kerry, Eleanor co-hosts this completely captivating and extremely educational podcast. It's called The Good Robot, which I use in my classes on AI. I highly recommend it. They both together interview people on the cutting edge of AI from industry, tech, education, social sciences, humanities, and activists. They're like 30-minute podcasts. They talk about decolonial AI, accessible AI, all the things that you're interested in. It's fascinating. I highly recommend it. And next we have in person in the flesh. We've been working together for like 2 years. I've never met her in the person, so I'm a little in awe. The in real life thing is real. An AI ethicist, author, and researcher focusing on combating anti-Asian racism in AI, currently affiliated with AI Now as a research fellow and serving as a visiting fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies at University College London. Also you're also still at Cambridge, aren't you, as a senior researcher? Kerry brings a wealth of knowledge and direct experience to today's discussion. In today's seminar, Kerry and Eleanor are going to dive into these thought-provoking questions such as what defines good technology? Is it achieving? It's feasible? How can feminist perspectives guide us in shaping a better technological future? And they're also going to unveil insights from their latest book, The Good Robot, Why Technology Needs Feminism. And just a quick note, I wanted to say that usually when people think of feminist AI, if they think of it at all as a niche or a boutique or a special interest, maybe related to gender bias mitigation in LLMs or female representation in technical fields or in the C-suite. But your work and Eleanor's, as I'm sure you're going to explain today, defines feminist AI in much broader terms and makes a case for centering it as essential in the design, development, and deployment of AI. So I'm going to turn this over. Please help me welcome our esteemed guests today.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much all for coming out and spending your lunch break with myself and Eleanor. And thank you, Michelle, for the kind introductions. And it's just so special to get to be here in person. Eleanor, thank you so much for being an absolute champion and coming in the evening via Zoom from Brussels. But yeah, I'm very happy to be here in person. And today what we wanted to do was actually just share this really special edited collection that we've been really privileged and lucky to get to edit, which brings together a large number of different voices who are all thinking about these questions of good technology. What is it? Is it even possible? And how can feminists and other kinds of pro-justice ideas and activism and movement help us get closer there? So Michelle was already kind of given a little bit of a background of what Eleanor and I do, but we've spent the past few years thinking about what feminism can bring to our understanding of technology, particularly AI. And so that's meant everything from doing academic research through to working with policymakers and working with industry professionals to think about what it would mean to tangibly implement the kinds of feminist work that we admire into the design and development process. Next slide, please, Eleanor. Okay, and the hardest part is over because the slide changed. The slides are always much more stressful than anything else. But a core part of our work alongside doing this more industry-focused work is specifically science communication. And so since 2021, Eleanor and I have co-hosted and produced a podcast called the Good Robot Podcast, which explores feminist approaches to technology by asking those three questions I mentioned earlier. What is good technology? Is it possible? How can feminism help us get there? And because this wouldn't be a presentation done by podcasters without an obligatory plug, you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever else you get your podcasts. But through the podcast, which started off very much as a classic kind of COVID project, we were all separated from one another. We were craving community and connection. We were craving ways to kind of share and disseminate and learn from other scholars in a time when we weren't meeting very many people. And so we started the podcast as a platform to be able to do that. And so through this multiple year process of collecting stories and interviews and questions from people who were thinking about very similar ideas and questions to us, we've been privileged enough to build this feminist community of scholars thinking about justice and technology. And it was this community that ultimately drove and culminated in the book that we're talking about today, which is The Good Robot: Why Technology Needs Feminism. Next slide, please. So that brings me to the book itself. So one of our primary goals with our podcasting and with our range of media communication work was to create content about feminism and technology that was bite-sized and relatively accessible, something that you could listen to on your 30-minute commute if you didn't have time to read a full book on gender theory or on academic literature that sometimes can be very inaccessible to people from other disciplines or to people who are working in industry. And I think the story of the work we've done so far has often been a rocky journey here. Like sometimes we've created material that has worked really well and has been able to be shared more widely. Sometimes we've realized actually some of the things that we've taken for granted needed a lot more explaining. They needed a lot more translation. And so we decided to try and take the same ethos of this podcast, which is saying, you know, what happens if we take our research and we try to make it as free and shareable as possible. And we took it and we tried to translate this into the book itself, which is a collection of bite-sized essays which all respond to the prompt, good technology is ... And so Eleanor is going to explore some of the specific essays and the specific responses in the latter half of this quick talk. But first, I want to explore some of the guiding principles and ideas that run across all these different essays and shape the volume as a whole. Next slide, please. So to kick us off, these kinds of core questions. And something we get asked quite a lot is, why do we even ask about good technology? And why call this book The Good Robot in the first place? Because a lot of people say, well, this is a really oversimplifying question. What does it mean for something to be good? Good for whom? How can we even think about goodness in the context of a world that in many ways is so fundamentally not good, as fundamentally unjust and discriminatory? And so in many ways, I think the question we ask is simplistic and reductive. And in many ways, it's also a lot more complex than initially first appears. So The Good Robot is pithy, but it's also a provocation. And here I want to draw on what one of our interviewees, Jack Halberstam, the queer theorist, said, which is that we're facing a crisis of the imagination when it comes to making good and just technologies. So often when we ask people about what good technology is, it's much easier for them to identify what it isn't. And I myself, again, coming from a background thinking very critically about technology, find myself always coming to the bad first. And so when we decided to ask people about good technology, it felt quite different to maybe what we were used to doing, but was also part of this broader project of saying, how do we thread the needle behind the techno-optimism that often characterizes tech development, particularly in, big tech firms, but also the techno-pessimism that can make it really hard for us to see a way out of this particular dilemma. And I was also reflecting on this question of good technology and maybe why it can be a bit more generative than we initially think, because some of my friends have recently just had children, and something that's very striking when you hang out with a 2-year-old is that sometimes the simplest questions are also just the most difficult to answer, like the question, why, which now haunts us every time I see my friends' children. And so in many ways, by asking a question that initially seems very simple, but can take us into very complex arenas and imaginatory areas of thought, we hope to expand our idea of what we think is possible when it comes to technology. Next slide, please. And so on that note, the other half of our podcast, along with this idea of good technology, is thinking about feminism and what that means. And Eleanor and I actually, when we have a bit more time and space to think about how we approach feminism and think about it, we actually prefer to say feminisms, plural, because feminist ideas, activism, beliefs, and thought is this really complex, contested, deeply compromised set of political beliefs and activism. So following bell hooks, we think about feminism as this fight to end sexist oppression, but it's also necessarily so much more than that, because we can't think about or understand gender or sexist oppression without thinking about a full range of different kinds of oppressions and different kinds of power vectors and relations, from racism to classism, from homophobia to ableism, and many other ways that harm and discrimination and inequality manifests in our societies. And so crucially, that also means that for us, feminisms are an ongoing conversation, one that's changing between us, both myself and Eleanor, ourselves and the guests that we have on, ourselves in relation to our societies. And we often have different views on things to our interviewees, to our authors, to each other. And that to us is also a really important part of what it means to do feminism in practice, allowing ourselves to be responsive to one another, allowing ourselves to learn, allowing ourselves to be uncomfortable, to disagree with one another, and allowing ourselves to change. So for me personally, feminism is about liberation. It's about being free to live fully and freely and expansively without the confines of various forms of oppression. So for both of us, we think of feminism as intersectional, as pro-trans, and as committed to ending forms of political violence like what we see across the world right now in areas from Xinjiang to Palestine. It's necessarily collective, not individualistic. And when we lose sight of feminism as this collective project, we also lose sight of what it can do for us and with us in the field of technology. And so sometimes, next slide, please, people ask,
do you want to say something about the lantern, this illustration and the lantern laws?
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. You're quite quiet.
Oh no, this illustration represents the lantern laws. I don't know whether it's worth just saying a bit about it, because it's so well represented in the illustration.
No, please say more.
No, go on.
If you want to say, please go ahead if you want to say something.
Oh yeah, well, I just thought, because this is one of the illustrations from the book, it represents the lantern laws. So in New York, I can't remember which was this 18th century, people of color had to hold lanterns walking around town. And you can see this really violent politics of visibility at play in facial recognition today. And I really like the way that Sinjin has represented the little eye coming out of that window at the bottom, and the violence through this knife here. Sorry, I'll pass back to Kerry.
For context, Sinjin is our incredible illustrator who's done all the illustrations throughout the volume, and so you're seeing their line drawings here. And so every chapter in the book has several illustrations attached to it, which are encapsulating some of the ideas from the essays, because some people, like myself, find visual illustrations often a bit more provocative and interesting, sometimes in the written word. But so why feminism specifically? And this is something I remember Catherine D'Ignazio, the author of Data Feminism, with Lauren Klein, talking about when it came to their book on data and feminism. And they said when they published this book originally, people said, why not call it data justice? Because, you know, that seems like something that can maybe appeal more broadly. And so something we want to also do with our approach to feminist thinking in this book is to say that, as Michelle, I think, beautifully outlined in the introduction, too often feminism is seen as a niche problem or something that is not necessarily relevant to any but a select few. And also too often, I think our conversations about feminism in technology can be limited to the idea of a headcount problem. So saying, actually, everything will be fixed if we just get more people with a certain kind of identity into the room. And look, you know, we also understand that that really matters. We think it does matter who's in a room. But at the same time, we think there's such a rich wellspring of feminist activism and work that goes far beyond just asking who's in the room to say, what do we actually want our technologies to do and be? Also because, as many, many scholars have shown, historically asking who's in the room has only really benefited the most privileged women. So instead, we think, what does it mean to bring feminism into tech? Next slide, please. It can mean a whole lot of different things. So for us, we see feminism as being profoundly about justice, material, spiritual, and epistemological, about practice, because it can't remain on the level of lofty goals or on high-level structures. Ultimately, it's about our lives and how we live them. It's messy and it's complex, as is the world around us. And it also helps us think about how we can build solidarities across difference in a world that's extremely divided. And that doesn't mean that feminism is never divisive, and it doesn't mean that it's comfortable at all, but that doing this hard work is really crucial. And so ultimately, we hold all that together to say that we think feminism is transformative. So this is a quote from the introduction. So we argue that feminist ideas, activism, and thought run like a golden current across generations. Feminism vibrantly illuminates the injustices of the world around us and galvanizes us to change them. Innately wild, it can be shocking, spiky, uncomfortable, even dangerous. Most importantly, feminism is transformative, whether this takes the form of the immediate flash of a lightning bolt or the slow, steady burn of generational change. So with that kind of overarching framing, next slide, please, I would like to take you to how we actually structured this book. What are the kind of core themes that run across the book as a whole before handing over to Eleanor to think about some of these essays in a bit more specificity. So we split the book into 5 sections: good relations, good systems, good designs, good visions, and good rebellions. And within these sections, we have a real plurality of views when it comes to thinking about the possibilities of technology and whether or not it even can be good or feminist in the first place. Next slide, please. So the first section of this book is good relations. And so what this section does is focuses on philosophies of coexistence and care. And so it thinks about technology through the lens of the question, how can we live better with one another? How can we design technology according to those principles? So for example, this joyful and quite playful illustration here on the slide is taken from Sneha Revaner's essay, which is thinking about good technologies intergenerational. So in the essay, Sneha is asking, what does it mean for us to think about technology that can bridge the generational gaps that we're currently experiencing? So a quote from this chapter is, if we keep our identities moving, it will allow us to be moved by each other and the world. All these chapters create this kind of movement and ask us to be emotionally stirred. Next slide, please. Our second section focuses on the idea of good systems. And so this means not just technical systems, making sure that systems are made well to ensure that they're fair, but also thinking about how tech systems are entwined with broader social and political systems, whether that's demographics of the tech industry through to broader carceral or surveillance systems that exist in many cities and across many states and countries. And so what the essays in this section do is they trace this longer socio-historical continuum of harm that originates through the inventions of various kinds of technologies and scientific disciplines and extend into the present day. Next slide, please. The third section is good designs. So this is thinking about design as both a noun and a verb. So both the blueprints for certain products, which maybe work well or work better. So for example, Meryl Alper has a section in this chapter on accessible technology and what it means for a tool to really be accessible. But also we think about design as a kind of process in this section. So thinking about what kinds of things do you need to have put in place to ensure that technologies can be made ethical and well. And I think this is particularly challenging with design because bad design is so much more obvious than good design in many cases. And so for one of the projects that we like to do when we think about good technology together is look at the very everyday designs that maybe have elements of goodness to them that we don't acknowledge because they're so normalized. Next slide, please. Our fourth section is the idea of good visions. So at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, where myself and Eleanor work, we run a large project on AI narratives. So saying, what kinds of stories do we tell about AI? Why do these stories matter? And all of the essayists in this section, including Michelle, argue that the stories that we tell about AI are really crucial for imagining who has a role to play in the future, what kinds of futures we want, and what kinds of technologies we're going to have. And so all of the authors in this section advocate for better visions of technology, more inclusive, more just, and better projections of the future. Next slide, please. And then finally, we end on a slightly more provocative and radical note, which is the section Good Rebellions. Something we really wanted to preserve throughout the volume was, again, a sense of disparity, of conflict, of tension between the different authors in the book. We have some authors in this book who have worked in tech their whole lives and for whom tech is very, very important. We have some who think we should just get off social media entirely and really don't believe in a lot of these new tech projects. And so in order to make space for this, we also want to include essays that believe that actually maybe this idea of the good robot itself, to quote Jack Halberstam, is itself a fantasy. And so this section is largely concerned with this question of what happens if we just say no to a lot of kinds of tech. And so that's a big no's and small no's, as this quote shows. So we might be thinking about these large-scale rejections, but also the kind of ordinary forms of resistance that we might all be engaging in from time to time. So I'm now going to hand over to Eleanor, who is going to explore some of the specific responses and answers people had in order to these prompts and ideas.
Well, thanks so much, Kerry. And yeah, Kerry made these slides, which is why they're beautiful. I think I made the following ones, which is they're a bit less nice. Yeah, the best thing about this book to me was all the incredible people in it. We get to meet people through the podcast, and this is why I wouldn't want to do any other job. Everyone really is delightful. It's a bit of a, sometimes can be a bit of an echo chamber, but we wanted to kind of challenge that a little bit in the kinds of people that we interviewed and the difference in perspective that Kerry talks about. So this is Frances. She's at Columbia. I'm so excited to see her next week at our at the kind of was it NYU and Columbia leg of our tour. And she's a filmmaker. She's really radical in the way that she does her work. And in the book, she talks about an art project that she did where she got delivered this probably stolen ATM, and they reconfigured it into a machine that would give people something of value that wasn't of monetary value. So they would give them a community currency, so a banknote with featuring different people from Puerto Rican history who'd done something really important in relation to social justice and education. So she plays with this idea of infrastructural disobedience, and she gets technology to elicit emotions in people. So on the right, there's really nice illustration of somebody experiencing some emotion and telling their story to this ATM in exchange for a bill for this community currency. And interestingly, people didn't actually spend the money. Because it was, you can spend it in different shops in the area, in different areas of Puerto Rico, in exchange for goods and services, but people actually felt that the reminder of what they truly value was so important to them that they didn't want to exchange it for anything. The project was part of her effort to explore decolonial joy. And I really liked how she talks about joy. Joy is not something necessarily that is at the heart of our everyday work in feminism. Joy, she defines through a number of different key theorists, one of which, interestingly, is Thomas Aquinas. And it's a response to, in his words, being united with what we love. Certainly for me, that's how I experience joy. So joy is prefigured in the design. It's built in from the very beginning. And the ATM, because it asks people what they value, this is a really interesting thing. Technology rarely does that. Technology imparts its values. It rarely asks us what we want from it. So, and the other theorist that she looks at is Shella Sandoval's term with decolonial love, which is a love felt, created and felt between people who've experienced the harms caused by hegemonic powers. And this love can be a technology of social transformation. And this is what people experience the moment that the bill is granted to them. I just really love this idea of playing with joy and emotion through the technologies that are repurposed by her in this project. And the final theorist that she discusses is Sasha Costanza-Chock, who's written quite a famous book called Design Justice that we really recommend, and that argues that we should be designing for collective liberation and that the design process must be community-driven. And this often seems quite abstract, quite difficult to imagine, particularly in the relation to the technologies that we use on a day-to-day basis. But I think that this project is really emblematic of how that could actually work. And while it's not a commercial product, and it should remain that way, I think it can impart different ideas, and we can use it to claim for better technologies in our day-to-day lives. One of the, I guess, perhaps most prominent thinkers in our book is N. Catherine Hales. When we reached out to her, I had all her books behind me on the bookshelf, so it was a really surreal feeling interviewing her in person. And she discusses the idea of biophilic relationships between humans and the non-human world. And that is a kind of consensual reaching out between these worlds, and it isn't extractive, and symbiosis between humans and the natural world isn't just an apartment with a tree in it. I love this idea because I'm so sick of hearing the phrase, we need to dominate AI before AI dominates us. No domination is necessary, Hale says. We need to step back from this language of control and dominance and look to symbiotic relationships like, I don't know whether you've ever seen sea anemones hitchhiking on the backs of hermit crabs, or oxpecker birds eating the ticks from the ears of buffaloes. And these examples show that symbiosis can be risky, like plover birds go inside the crocodile's mouth to pick off tiny bits of food between their teeth. It's not without risk that we enter into these symbiotic relationships. Sometimes the question of control, of controlling AI, reminds me very much of colonial efforts to either control a nation or control nature. That reminds me of the 17th century Tuileries gardens in Versailles in Paris, that if you Google them, you'll see lots of topiary, which is unnatural geometric shapes made out of bushes. These gardens were very famous for hedges squared off at right angles, lawned, carved into patterns that look like tapestries from above. It's a style that's very much about control, man's power and control over nature, the ability to tame wilderness into our idea of an aesthetically pleasing order. And then now we know that these gardens are really unsustainable. We've got back into rewilding. And this is sort of what we need to be doing in relation to AI. We need to think about how rewilding practices can actually inform building sustainable, environmentally responsible systems. I began being interested in feminism in relation to ecofeminism, which is a branch of feminism and political ecology. And it rethinks the relationship between humans and the natural world. So it's really nice to be able to engage with this branch of study again in relation to AI. And on the left, you've got a kind of interesting illustration based on the quote that is on the bottom of the screen. And I've forgotten one punctuation mark, which is classic me with slides. And it's, you have to go to where they live. This is the engineers that Hales is talking about. So you have to go to the engineer's place of work and make the first move and ask, can I come visit you in your lab? Going out on a limb, going to people who are doing something different in the world of AI, asking to create this kind of political and work-related friendship, I think is so important if we're to try and understand each other and why AI ethics is and isn't progressing in the ways that we want it to. I really like this. I think that we all need to be more proactive and rather than kind of, gossip and be mean to each other behind the scenes, in our case, maybe bitching about engineers. No, we don't want to do that. We want to go and learn from each other and make the first move. One of my favorite all-time engineers is this guy, David Adelani, who actually came to our UCL book launch, which was so lovely. And David works for this really cool organization called McInerney. And what they're trying to do is make natural language processing work for over 2,000 very widely spoken African languages. It's a non-for-profit, so if you have time, money, and interest, do seek them out. And this work is extraordinarily difficult, as is any kind of community organizing. It's voluntary work that is making these systems more inclusive. And it's people like David who are committing their time for free to all these people to make it happen. And he says, we at McInerney, we are a good technology. And I really like that because he's not thinking about the technology itself that they're creating or the multiple technologies that they're contributing to. He's defining the organization as this good technology. because they create other technologies that improve people's quality of life without harming any group of people, and that work well in the places they're intended to be used in. And he said, he'd gladly give 30 minutes of his time if it meant encouraging people to do their work. He's incredibly generous. And it's not generosity that's naive. There's so many different kind of always in-house fighting and politics and, different directions of research that people want to go into. So he is a very strong and extremely, someone that I'm really proud that is working for our cause. Catherine D'Ignazio of MIT, very cool, runs the Data Plus Feminism Lab, wrote an amazing book called Data Feminism that many of you have heard of. And she talks about community activism in tech companies. To me, it's incredibly heartening to see the unions like Apple Together rise up and hold different companies accountable. She says, I'm heartened when community activism puts pressure within the organization, and that becomes enough for a company to realize what it cannot do, that it cannot abide by a status quo way of operating. To me, that is so important, that people who may not consider politics or activism a part of their job, or may consider activism to be a dirty word, actually realize that tech unions will defend them, will make sure that the work that they're doing is ethical, that they can go home and be proud of what they do, that they don't have, people on the internet or their families saying, why are you working for Cambridge Analytica, or why have you built this deep learning system that actually is proven to discriminate. We met with the one of the founders of Apple Together, and my lasting memory of her will always be that she was so diplomatic, so dignified, so engaged. Even when she was talking about Apple, the company that had fired her, that had treated her so badly, and it's a way of treating the people that hurt you. That I also saw with Judith Butler when asking them about how difficult it was to talk to evangelical Christians that disputed their very existence. To be able to channel that diplomacy and dignity is very much what I aim for in my life and fail to on a daily basis. And then briefly, Halberstam. So Kerry talked a little bit about him and how he features in the book, but I really like the idea of getting off that he talks about. He says, he wrote in a manifesto called Get Off, which advocates for going offline and for thinking with the pleasures of not being on, literally getting off in a kind of masturbatory sense, and to try and re-find pleasure in the act of leaving social media, which is what you've got on the left with the Twitter birds, the birds flying from the phone, which I really like. And on the right, there's a kind of interesting abstract representation of their line. We don't want technology that's better at recognizing bodies. We want bodies that are better at evading technological recognition. And this is trying to talk about the decision to either make technologies like facial recognition more representative of diverse minorities. But then on the other hand, the problem with that is that, for example, women of color are way more likely to be at the butt end of surveillance through discriminatory surveillance, through state surveillance and control. So how do we want to progress with these really tricky ethical questions? I like the idea of bodies that evade recognition. I think that we all do to a certain extent. And I'm interested to see on how maybe really radical technologists can play with this idea in the future. And yes, this is, I don't know, is this the QR code, Kerry, for the book? I don't know.
The QR code if you would like to get a copy of the book. But yeah, thank you so much, Eleanor, for exploring some of those different responses. That's really just a slice of some of the different perspectives that you'll find in the book. And I now believe we're actually going to go to a kind of Q&A session where we would love to answer any questions that you have about the book. the podcast or any of the topics we've raised, but also the process of writing and thinking in this way, because it's something that both Eleanor and I are thinking about very actively as we do this work. And so that's a conversation we'd be delighted to have. But I think I'm now going to hand over to Michelle for the Q&A portion of the discussion.
I'm going to get cozy. I think so. You can hear me. Okay. I took so many notes that I bled right through, so we'll see if I can actually get. First of all, thank you both so much. I've heard you talk about this at such length, and we have some Slido questions that are coming in too, but let me open up with a few of my own, and then we'll turn to a couple in the audience, and then also open up to Slido as well then too. And I'm going to actually jump around because I do want to come back to this question about participatory design that you're evoking a lot and that you actually enact in more detail, because I think people really want to get down to the granular level. What does this look like in practice? But I wanted to open up with, since you're both from the UK, actually thinking about feminist AI in a global context. So the European Union recently proposed the first EU regulatory framework for AI and just released the EU AI Act that they're updating again. UK, of course, has a national AI strategy since 2022, I think, and they keep updating. The UN General Assembly just adopted a landmark resolution on global human rights and AI to refrain, quote, this is a quote from them, refrain the release and the use of artificial intelligence systems that are impossible to operate in compliance with international human rights law or that pose undue risks in the enjoyment of human rights. So you've advised the Prime Minister, if I recall correctly, on AI, and you've actually created, you were one of the first people, I think it was you, who actually had done some work on bias in systems and hiring. But can you talk about feminism in the context of the difference between the UK and the EU regulations and the US, all of which are on a continuum, usually assessing risk balancing, or it's framed as innovation versus regulation. Specifically, how can feminist approaches to AI contribute to those conversations across the public and private sectors between government and industry? Do you have any specific examples from your own research or consulting work?
I mean, Eleanor, do you want to jump onto this first? Because you're doing a really fantastic project thinking very specifically about the EU regulatory landscape.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great question. Never thought I'd be doing regulation work, but here we are. I actually bailed from law school the day before I was supposed to go, to my parents' great horror. And here I am back again, so I think they won. I run a project at our centre, building hopefully the world's first online free open access tool that helps companies meet the EU AI Act's obligations. And this is basically an auditing tool. And I don't know whether you've ever seen an auditing tool, but they're really dull. And we wanted to make something that was a bit more exciting, informative, that would upskill engineers and product managers. So it's targeted to the people with an oversight role in a project, building an AI system. And it guides you through from the ideation stage through to maintenance and looking after your data and the kind of main building phases, how you should approach this. But we do things very differently. So we define the EU's key terms through feminist and anti-racist principles. So we don't buy into this kind of wishy-washy, make sure your system doesn't have bias in it approach, because we know that engineers have different understandings even of what bias is. Some of the engineers that Kerry and I interviewed at a big tech company a couple of years ago talked about bias as the intersection of the X and Y axis, or saying that they didn't know what kind of bias they should be looking out for, because bias has its own definitions mathematically. So instead, what we're trying to do with these kinds of regulation tools is think about how can we redistribute power through AI systems. And I talked about an ideation phase that's so important at the beginning, because if you're building a hiring tool that claims to be able to strip race and gender from a candidate's personality, from a candidate's body, that doesn't work. You can't actually do that. So it doesn't matter how you build the tool. It doesn't matter whether your maintenance practices are good, because the actual idea underlying the system is rubbish. Why the EU AI Act? Well, it was supposed to be much more to be really something that was going to be taken up across the globe. The UK now, sadly, post Brexit, we really don't we don't want to do what the EU is doing, which means that we're going to really fall behind in equality processes. I think that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow, also here in Brussels, because the EU is notoriously more advanced in equality principles than the UK, which takes an innovation approach, pro-innovation approach. But this idea, as Michelle, you just talked about pitting innovation against regulation, makes it seem as though innovation really doesn't need regulation. And actually, we know that not all innovation is good. Some innovations can be bad. Like, we don't want more harmful technologies. Those are bad innovations. And so good regulation should support good innovation. And that's the message that we really want to put through in these kinds of technologies. And then on the US, there's some really specific, quite cool laws around hiring technologies in Illinois and in New York. And I'm kind of interested to see this sort of decentralized approach to creating good regulation around AI in the US. But I imagine because US technologies will be subject to the EU AI Act, when they're deployed in Europe, that it will still be the EU AI Act that has most effect globally.
Thank you. That's going to be such a challenge, actually, because especially with commercial off-the-shelf products that are even less regulated than at the government level than too, let alone in the EU. Did you want to add to that, or?
No, I thought that was great. Thank you, Eleanor. I guess I also wanted to say as well, you know, while we're thinking a lot about particularly the context that we're based in, which is the UK, Eleanor with the EU, myself a little bit with the US regulatory landscape through the AI Now Institute, although again, as someone who is definitely not a lawyer, the kind of granular textures of regulatory schema is definitely not my area of expertise, so don't quiz me. But, you know, I think something that we're certainly like very interested in thinking about further is this question of like the global percolation of a lot of these technologies and what necessarily happens when you see, I mean, hiring technology is one of the examples we look at a lot, like what happens when you take tools which are developed in one context, such as the US, with very, very specific and particular ideas about things like what race is, what gender is, what kinds of identity categories are seen to matter, how they pertain to different people. And then they get used in places around the world where those things look very, very different and they mean very different things. You know, I grew up in a country where how we think about things like race is wildly different to here and very, very different to the UK. And so a lot of the tools I think we see coming out just simply wouldn't work in those contexts and could have like quite a lot of significant disadvantages. Yeah.
This is related to the issue that you were talking about, Eleanor, too, but I know it's top of mind for a lot of people is this private-public navigation. Where does the responsibility lie? You were talking about, you know, industry maybe self-regulating or creating them with audit systems, which, you know, there's a plethora of them, of course, everywhere. But how they're developed actually for those kind of priorities you were just mentioning is different. That's a big issue about where are you distributing it? Is it going to come from the EU for these EU acts, or is it going to come from industry themselves, or how to navigate that? And I don't know if it's clear to the audiences here, but you all work on the ground very closely with industry. So one of my questions related to this was, you know, everyone talks about participatory design, but it's really hard to actually bring in community of activists, industry, scholars, the legal institutions, people in education, social scientists, because the vocabularies are also different. And then at a granular kind of technical level, just like a lot of people here want to actually, they may buy into what you're saying, but then it becomes very difficult on the ground. Can you give us an example of actually, because you have talked to my classes about this, because the students in the classes I teach on AI, they're like, okay, but I like exactly how are you going to manifest this? What is this actually going to look like in a particular scenario? And I remember you talking to my students, I think it was last quarter, about some of the examples of how you bring in participatory design. So it's not simply bringing in impacted communities, you know, once a product is already in the wild and then noblesse oblige, you know, come on in, like help us refine our product so it doesn't harm you too much. So you all had a different vision of how that actually would work in different spaces. I don't know if, before we go to general questions, just so you could mention that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll offer a couple of quick comments and then pass on to Eleanor, because I know that is something they're thinking about very intentionally with the tool design. I guess for me, what participatory design has looked like in practice, I think the first thing has been going back to thinking through like what communities am I part of, what communities are important to me, what relationships do I have, and like what would I have wanted 5 or 10 years ago from technologies, what would I have wanted designers to be providing, because I think that going back to those relationships and saying, you know, who is this ultimately for, and making that really concrete can be quite powerful. And so a lot of my research is very unabashedly selfish in that sense. It's about kind of going back and saying, like, actually, I think a lot of communities where I'm from or places that are really important to me, like, are currently underserved by the way that we talk about technology. And
Wait, so say it, because industry is perfectly happy to tell you what you need.
yeah,
They're like coming and saying,
exactly.
here's this accessible tool.
Yeah.
We're gonna, you know, we have an ed tech. We're gonna give it to you. So
Yeah.
how do you now, if you're somebody who has a need, how is it you're gonna reframe the power relations so that you are also the creator and not just the user?
Yeah, and like most of my experiences with like anything participatory design related is just saying like, hey, I'm really interested in this because this is something that I perceive that I think I would have really valued, and me talking to other people in a similar position and them saying, no, we are profoundly not interested in that. We don't think it's a good idea. And I think a lot of all the participatory work I do is like also just taking that refusal seriously, or people saying, well, actually, you know, but I think the more you have that conversation, people will say, well, actually, I don't think that's a good idea, but what we really want is this, or we want something that will bring us closer here, or just that's not a good use of resources. And I think the more that we prioritize that kind of response and those questions, like the closer we'll get to design processes that maybe produce things that are useful for us.
Did you want to add to that? I'm always thinking about the power relations, like when and where you're inviting them in. And you both are so particular about the architecture of those engagements because there are power differentials as well. We have Slido, but I also want to, sorry.
Oh, I wanted just to show you, so the way that we're thinking about participatory design is different because it happens at all stages of the process. And I think one of the things that we were keen to show is the relationship between AI ethics and diversity and inclusion, and why it matters, because a lot of engineers were really confused about what a diverse team is, and how that relates to what they're building. So people would say, you know, like, oh, our team is really diverse. We had this like Dutch guy and like, you know, an Irish guy and, you know, people from everywhere. And we were like, okay. So there's obviously a lack of understanding about what the point of diversity is and what it means, and how it relates to different technologies. And then this is like this is the kind of back end slide from our GitHub of the tool that we're making. And we kind of explain the different, for example, we were thinking about participatory design, like different workshops and how they can be done. And thinking about, for example, access and disability justice, what disability is. I think it's so important to go back to definitions of things. You know, what does disability mean in this world? It's not an illness that like some engineers may think, something that is socially produced in many ways. And I quite like this like phrase, disability is society minus accessibility. And then what the EU says about it. And once we've explained why, then we can explain how. Because I think, you know, these kinds of tools are really lacking the why question of like, why do participatory design and what is it? Like, what's the point? Rather than just giving people an approach that doesn't really respond to those questions. So we really take people step by step and say, this is exactly what participatory design really means, and this is how you can do it.
Thank you. We should have a resource list. I'm just going to have a resource of the work that you're doing, because especially think of the implications of that, as I know you have, for assistive technologies that are being created here actually at Stanford that come with the assumption that the body or people who are differently able needs to be corrected or improved and all of that. There's so many, and consent, yes, which takes me to another question too that I actually have, but actually I'll pause that really quickly. Do we have questions first from the audience, and then I can take a few from Slido as well? Yes.
Hi, everyone. Lucia Vitali. I'm a global health scholar at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I was actually at your talk at ISA last week, Dr. Kerry McInerney, and that was on techno-Orientalism, which was another fantastic kind of dimension of your work. So thank you for that. So I was really taken by this ambition that you both put forth in your book to kind of communicate between techno-pessimism and techno-optimism. And so on Monday at UC Santa Cruz, we hosted a professor from Ohio State, and we were thinking about what Afrofuturist literatures can tell us about the future of technology and how we can create and design better AI tools. And so I was noticing as you were kind of breaking down these 6 different codes in your book, or these core themes rather, that you're really kind of going through these processes of designing a good tech, implementing good technology, and then kind of looking to the future of these outcomes. And so I was wondering if we could kind of enter into an imaginary space for a moment. And so my question to you both is what you both imagine with these, if we could, as you kind of began this talk, design a just technology and implement it, what kinds of outcomes do you both see in society, in politics, in our world in general? Thank you.
Oh, that's a really lovely question. Do you want to take multiple questions in one go or just go one by one?
What world do you imagine the future? But sure, we can take, why don't I take a few? Thank you. And then we can actually, and then you can select between the two. I think your hand up was first. I'm going to let Casey, can you pick, because I'll lose track of who's in order. Q. Thank you.
First, thank you for the amazing talk. My name's Greg. I'm coming from the University of Tartu in Estonia. And I was struck by the amount of issues that you have spotted in different processes, be it regulatory processes or developing engineering processes, and also ethics. And I wanted to ask how or what sort of questions in ethics do you see as the most immediate in finding an answer to, for example, how to conceive of a justice that is global in its scale, not justice only here in the United States or justice in the UK. And I'm asking this because the tools that are already developed and will be developed, the AI tools, they will be deployed globally, and people across the world will use, and they'll use them by the same sense of justice as it has been developed, say, here. Yes, thank you.
These are hard questions. These are important. These are the important questions then too. Maybe let me throw one more at Slido, and then we'll go back to okay. One more, and then I will do Slido.
Thank you so much. I am Hale and member of the public. I would like to start with a question from a female director of one of the programs here at Stanford. When I mentioned about the 10% of the world population right now living in gender apartheid, and she in Islamic countries, over 800 million women are counted as half people. And then she asked me, she said, how we have never heard. And I said, because Arab studies and Islamic studies at Stanford and Harvard and everywhere is paid by the rich guys from Islamic world, and women don't have any voice. And here we have 10% of world population that are voiceless, choiceless, powerless. And I am here to ask you, what, because I was hoping when I saw the feminists in technology and AI, I was thinking to ask you, what are the vision of you about this 10% of world population, women who are totally silent? And what is your vision about protecting them who speak up like me in media? Because I realize wherever that I say that, people just silence down women who talk about that. What are you going to do as for this issue, global issue? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So you got 3 giant.
Yes. Yeah. Eleanor, do any of those questions particularly jump out to you to kick us off?
You go first because you're in person and that's always more fun.
You're very, very large behind us, though. So you actually have a more imposing.
I am.
You
I'm
are,
so
like,
huge. I'm
very,
so
very
pale.
No, thank you for all those questions. I guess maybe to come to this question first about futures, and thank you so much also for coming back to hear me talk again. That's very kind of you. Yeah, I mean, I think I actually do want to have a moment to kind of point towards different kinds of projects that are doing this kind of speculative work, which I think is really, really fantastic. So the Indigenous AI Protocol and the Indigenous AI Working Group has quite a range of different speculative design projects where they do try to think about what would it mean to design these kinds of technologies that are both just and very contextual to specific kinds of cultures and places and contexts. And I think those projects which are developed in community are really, really wonderful examples of this. And I also, like I personally do myself turn a lot to science fiction for thinking about these questions of the imagination.
You read different kind of science fiction than 1950s cis male, white male.
Yes. So yeah, most
Point that out. There's different.
Yeah. And actually, if that's something any of you are interested in, I do have like quite a big repository of. I focus largely on like science fiction written by people in the Chinese diaspora. Eleanor did her PhD on science fiction written by women in Europe. And so like, I think, a big part of the podcast and the book as well, and certainly this section on this idea of good visions, is this idea of like, there actually is so much extraordinary work out there, which like does do this critical and imaginative work, but often doesn't necessarily get the oxygen or the airtime that a lot of other work does. And so when we say we need more stories, I don't think we want to imply that like those stories aren't there, but more just that like which stories get funded, which stories go to Hollywood, which stories, get print runs. Yeah, which stories animate tech, which ones get sent out to read at PayPal, for example. It's probably not these kinds of critical projects. So Eleanor, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree. I really think that, as David Adlani said, the good technology is the process. It is the organization. And this is why I think it's so important that maybe, we understand that AI can be a bit of a red herring, really. We need to think about good organizations, good systems, good processes. And this idea is taken in parts from most of my study at the beginning of my academic career was in utopian studies. And thinking about utopia not as a blueprint in a kind of Thomas More, here's the map of the utopia and it must be laid out like this, because that veers towards fascism. And I did my PhD in Bologna, and fascism is a very recent memory slash a kind of current day-to-day there. And so they were really concerned with rethinking how utopia is done and what constitutes utopia. And there's a great book called Utopian Method Vision, authored by two of the people who I worked with, and that explores the idea of utopia as process. So I think what Kerry and I really want to do is explore better processes, and that's part of the participatory design is a utopia. It is an acted utopia. And then I just wanted to say really quickly, there's two great, like very different versions of utopian thinking in relation to science fiction. One is some of the books I read were like 17th century French women's utopias, where women would run away from their husbands and go and live alone with a library, And another one, Aliette de Baudel, who's a French Vietnamese writer, thinks about the far future and its technologies being quite matriarchal, but also you have these AI mind ships birthed of human women with an ancestor spirit that's part of it. But it's not some kind of like clean, sickly utopia. All these utopias have their challenges and their contradictions.
I want to bring, if I can, back to a couple of questions that were asked that are very grounded. One was about how do you implement justice and technologies globally and worldwide. It's also a Slido question too, especially without just reenacting cultural norms that may be particularly Western or whatever. And then the other one was a question also about activism in the ground, because it's one thing I'm seeing them lurking in the questions is talking about different imaginative possibilities in the world, but then what does that actually look like in terms of technical, like very practical. You said systems, but actually that's very difficult, not just because of for-profit motives, but also because, look, even at this university, we're in Gates right now. I teach interdisciplinary studies. Fields of studies are siloed. Engineering majors have a high unit load. This is an elective if they're in the audience. And so, but the stakes are high, as our earlier audience member was asking about, like, what are we actually doing? How does this link up with activism too? So that's the worldwide question is a question for a couple of people then too, which is how can we make these standards of justice in tech worldwide without reproducing a certain kind of colonizing of thought as well? And it dovetails a little bit, I think, with your question.
Yeah, I mean, if I can jump on that quickly first, Eleanor, if that's fine. I guess I have a couple of thoughts on this. It's something that's very, very active in my own thinking. It's also something that's always changing. It's something where, like, I'm always working with partners and with colleagues who are always kind of re-teaching me things and showing me different ways of thinking about this question of global justice. Like, and I think this is one of the strengths of feminist thinking and theorizing, is despite the kind of many, many, many problems of white and imperial feminisms that have been long demonstrated over the history of feminist movements, we also have really rich histories of feminist transnational solidarities. And I think those can teach us a lot about what global justice means.
I have a question for you. This is I'm channeling my students here, actually. Practically, right, on the ground, you're in Davos, and if you're a technologist, you're trying to scale something. How are you going to scale that? Because actually, even the wonderful piece that Eleanor was showing, it's a performance piece, and I always get questions from the students like, yes, this is really great, it's opening up my mind, but it's not scalable. Not that everything has to be scalable, but it's like, what is this actually going to translate into?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like how I would think about this very practically, and again, my thinking of this is changing, so it might be in 2 years' time you ask me this question again, it's like, no, I don't think that. I mean, I think the big first thing is, like, when we're thinking about global justice, I think it's getting our own house in order, which is like in places like the UK or particularly in the US, think of where we are in the heart of Silicon Valley. Like, we are in this position where actually I think one of the best things we can be doing to ensure a globally just tech project is ensuring that some of these things just don't get developed in the first place. If we have the ability to say, actually, we can intervene right here and right now and say, this is just not something that should exist, rather than saying like, oh, well, the problem is how this tech is getting exported.
Well, if I think of Altman and OpenAI, there is the whole approach too, which is we're going to create it and we're going to release it into the wild.
Yeah,
and you're going to figure out how so there's these competing approaches to that.
Yeah, and I think so. And something I know the AI Now Institute is like very passionate about, or puts a huge amount of their work into, is saying, well, we think that the major issue is this concentration and this monopoly of tech power in certain large platform companies. And that's why we're seeing so many of these hyper-scaled and dangerous projects being created and released. And so I think to some extent, like, while we're kind of at the heart of that, like, that's where we should be striking. So I think that's kind of one big thing. And then I think this actually speaks to kind of multiple of these questions. I think the second thing, again, is I'm always trying to think about in my projects, how can I be, taking and using the resources that I have based in a research center where I am into different contexts and saying like, okay, where can I be the most useful, or what can I actually do to support the projects that are already happening to resist kinds of tech expansion or tech projects on the ground. And sometimes that work is not very sexy. Like, sometimes that means I'm just like sending a lot of emails, or I'm just trying to get grant funding for different organizations. And like, that work is also really crucial. And it maybe is less, exciting or interesting looking than like some of the other work that I get to do, like speaking to all of you wonderful folks here. But I think sometimes that's like what this global justice looks like. It looks like the very mundane processes of trying to push back on certain things. Eleanor, I don't know if you have anything to add. I know that was quite long.
Yeah, no, great. Some examples of companies I think are awesome. There's Hugging Face that Margaret Mitchell now works for, that are very, they're the AI community building the future, but they everything is open source. It's very transparent. They take data collection really seriously. They make sure that their data sets are full of data that have been taken consensually. And they work with an awesome company called Spawning that is still a non-for-profit, and they build consent layers. So they build those big data sets that have been consensually created. And I think there's lots of amazing like relationships that those kinds of companies have. I also think that what's really important on the activism front is putting engineers in touch with investigative journalists, encouraging engineers to join tech unions. I think a lot of what we do is really activisty, and it's joyfully our center is okay with that. I would thought by this point that, I'd written enough stuff about the police or whatever to be, silenced by the center, but that's totally okay. And often this work is deemed, well, I was chatting at dinner with these two Swedish women who work for the Equality Commission in Sweden, and they're told often that their work is activism, when what they're doing is basically, for people who've been discriminated against at work, they make sure that they can file complaints, and then they hold the people who did that responsible. That's not activism in a sense that it's part of the national status quo, like that's just the law. And it's deemed activism. So I really want that to become activism, not to be a dirty word anymore. Yeah, my parents think it still is, and I'm trying to just combat that.
I think feminism and activism both come with charged associations then too. But one of the works you did, and then there's a couple people in the audience, I want to make sure I get a question, is in terms of activism particularly that was new to my students was the invisibilized labor that went with either the ghost workers or the frontline workers who are either exploited or underpaid or unrecognized, all the labor that goes into labeling those images, whether it's child pornography or decapitations, all the mental health consequences. That making that public, there's some activist journalists in those particular spaces. Most of those workers originally were in the global South. Then all the euphemisms that are used to sort of invisibilize that labor was also a form. I would call that activism, just bringing into relief and making more transparent the processes of data collection and the cost, the human cost to that labor. Questions? I know we only have a few more minutes, and I love the questions that people are asking, and I want to make sure we get a couple more.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Abdul, a postdoc in AI ethics at Stanford. You mentioned that feminism and good technology is relative to who we are asking. I'm curious if you have asked ChatGPT what it thinks feminism is and good technology, and if there's any of the perspectives that you mentioned came up from the answers. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Should we take a few questions? And then.
Hi, I'm Tommy. I'm a master's student here in AI. I guess what I'm really curious about and what I work with Michelle on a little bit is like OpenAI does actually have a human alignment team. A lot of these industry partners have.
You must tell them about your critique.
Yeah, but they like have alignment, they have ethics teams, they have human-centered teams. And then when you look at their work, it's actually sometimes unethical. Sometimes I would actually argue probably worse for the common good. And so I'm just curious maybe on this whole idea of language, how you feel like some companies are co-opting like a good technology movement and like the pushback you feel of coming in when you work with the human-centered team and you're like, oh, I feel like we have very different definitions of human-centered or something like that. Thank you. Yeah,
the question of alignment that you, as a technologist, look at align. It's one of the many euphemisms. I think you pointed out it was OpenAI had created it, and it's like it's resolved the question. But the question that you're bringing about aligned with what values? Who decides what values there are? How are they embedded or not? It's sort of, and also anything in passive voice. And some English professors like, who did the aligning? One more question for you all, then we can.
Or otherwise one from Slido as well.
I've been sort of channeling Slido. There's a couple of the top most popular ones, which is, can you elaborate on how biomimicry is a good design and how it can be applied to technology or robots? The symbiosis that Kate Hales was talking about, I don't think is the same one in terms of this, but that was one question. One of the questions related to the illustration that Eleanor described, how do we want to be monitored, when and where? Are we going to be peoples of color are overly surveilled, or versus the whole question of visibility that Joy Bulamwini works on. And then the last one, which I do think is top of mind for my students and probably with the work you do, which is I'm reading with much interest about the following discursive frames: indigenous AI, decolonial AI, feminist AI, are the ways for these bodies of thought. They're coming together in synergistic ways. Otherwise, it's a lot. They didn't say that, I'm saying it's a lot.
Can I just say on that last note, I think the question of biomimicry, I think that's really interesting because, of course, drones are often designed based on the wings of different insects. Mimesis is not always empathy, while Walter Whitman and other philosophers would have it so. And I think it's really important to kind of retain that in mind. The co-option note I think is super important because I think co-option is always inevitable and that's okay, but we just need to really listen out for it. We develop our critical awareness within organizations that that's what's happening. And then we need to move on and develop new ideas, new concepts. And eventually they will be co-opted and then we move on again. So we just really need to kind of stay vigilant, basically, rather than kind of throw our hands up in desperation. Although that's extremely, that feels always the thing that you want to do.
Critically, as you said, just using the word alignment. It's showing up in all aspects of my, like over the dinner table now. It's in my bloodstream as if it solves anything particularly, but it's hard to get at those euphemistic expressions.
Yeah, totally. I think Kerry's the expert in kind of euphemisms and analogies.
I was going to say, just like as a life thing, like I use a lot of euphemisms. So, no. Yeah, I mean,
work with AI analogies.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Good. I was just checking it wasn't my sort of general, my general use of euphemisms. No, I mean, I think this question around asking ChatGPT about feminism is very interesting. I have not personally done it, but the person I know who has done this quite extensively, my husband is an academic as well, and he works in men's violence prevention and men's engagement in feminism. And so he used to do a lot of teaching and comes from an educationalist background. And something that he was very interested in that I was very skeptical of was, is there a possibility that there's going to be men turning to ChatGPT to ask questions about feminism and be like, is this, what kinds of answers will it give them? And so he's been kind of
right now.
But he's been kind of doing this ongoing project because I have a lot of anecdotal evidence that there are particularly men turning to ChatGPT in relation to loneliness. And this is something that's come out just in my own conversations with people about how they and why they use the tool. But yeah, I remember he was saying like his reflections on like having these conversations with ChatGPT about feminism were actually a lot more nuanced than he expected. And a lot more complex. And so I think so I was very skeptical.
I'm suspicious only because the way you framed feminism, I can see ChatGPT authoritatively doing some history of certain kinds of feminism debate, but not actually getting at the messiness that you were talking about.
Yeah. And I also just think understanding like why certain ideas have risen up and become really important in feminist thinkings or in feminism's kind of plural. Like, I think that's also just like a hugely important part of feminist work and how we think about and archive these different kinds of feminist history is also really important. And I think that's something you just like can't see with ChatGPT. But then I also see this as a little juncture because he's a practitioner and he's someone who works with men and boys all the time. And so, he's having to think very practically about like, what can we use? How can we get from A to B? So he's, I think, responding a bit more to the question maybe your students are asking. So sometimes I have to kind of
create like a curated for Feminist AI or something like that, but doesn't necessarily address that larger issue.
Yeah. And I think my question's almost more the like political economy critique or concern, which is like my worry is if people think like, oh, actually, if you have a conversation with ChatGPT that's going to help you on this journey to becoming feminist, that people will then use that to defund or further defund like existing programming that we already have designed specifically for engaging men in feminism or engaging men to talk about masculinity. Those programs are beautiful and expensive and complicated, and they're the first things to get cut when there's a budget cut. And we saw that very, very actively in 2020 during COVID. And so, yeah, I think that's almost where my concern is.
That's a great point because you can't necessarily expedite social justice.
Yeah, well, that's what Eleanor and I saw with hiring software is so many people saying, oh, well, this is really exciting to us because instead of putting money into our DEI programs, we can buy software that will like do this for us. And we say, well,
DEI is on the chopping block.
And we're like, well, actually, there's a lot of problems with this. And one of them is this idea of like, we can outsource this difficult work to technologies and it can, without question, do it for us. I
hate to say this, but we're out of time. Thank you all for your excellent questions. Please join us next time, May 1st, for the release of the AI Index with HI's very own Nestor Maslaj, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you all very much.